Yeah, I think I'll probably go right at 35 minutes. It's theoretically possible that I could stop before 35 minutes, but I'm a law professor. Seems unlikely. We'll see what we're doing. And to follow up on Michael Burlingame, yeah, I've gotten two speaking engagements from Michael Burlingame because I sent him a chapter that criticized Michael Burlingame. And said, Michael Burlingame is wrong on this, and he's also wrong on this. I sent that to him, and his response is to invite me to speak. So it shows you historians are pretty thick-skinned. And we're one and one. He conceded on one point, and the other one he won't give up. All right, so what I want to talk about today is Abraham Lincoln and how his views changed on what happens after slavery ends. Okay, we think Lincoln's anti-slavery, but slavery ends. What happens after that to the freed slaves? And so, for most of his political career, Lincoln supported gradual emancipation. Like even during the Civil War, he's coming up with emancipation schemes that would take slavery to like 1900. So, gradual emancipation. And colonization of freed slaves. And colonization is like immigration to either Liberia or Central America, Mexico. Different countries are being put out there. And then, so before the Civil War, what happens after slavery ends? That's just a hypothetical question. Okay, it's not a pressing issue on what's going to happen when slavery ends, because no one, including Lincoln, sees it ending anytime soon. All right, so so let's kind of go over the two things here. All right, so first we have colonization. All right, and this is this idea that you have free blacks. So if blacks are freed, then there's immigration. And the supporters of colonization differ on some things. So one of them is whether it's voluntary or not. Can you force freed blacks to go, leave the United States, or is it voluntary? Lincoln almost consistently is for voluntary emancipation because he supports this idea that there shouldn't be slavery because it's a violation of natural right. Well, if you have natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, you would have the basic decision on whether you want to stay or go. All right, and then the other question is where would this be? So Liberia is set up as this republic that basically blacks from the United States would go to, and then other countries. Liberia is very unpopular with blacks to to go. They don't want to go there. So the supporters of colonization start thinking about other places, and so Haiti is one. Mexico is floated during the Civil War as a possible place, and then various countries in Central America. All right, so the rationale for colonization, there's like two different main ideas on this. And sometimes someone like Lincoln, I think, is holding both of them at the same time. And sometimes he's just, holding one of them. But one is the reason you can't have, if slaves are freed, you can't have blacks and whites coexist in a society, okay? Because of black inferiority. So it could never work. You could never have a civil society. This is the idea that you can't have a multiracial society. It can't work. Okay, and a lot of this is based on, the underpinnings are just, racist, all right? The other notion is that it's never going to work because of white racism. That white racism is just intractable. It's not going away, and because it's intractable and not going away, it's never going to work, okay? And so there are, on the idea that the problem is white racism, blacks who support colonization, that's what they're looking at. It's like, we need to go somewhere else because this is never going to work. Okay, and then there's, so last week I found a pamphlet by a white abolitionist named James Burney, and that's his notion. He said that this isn't a great choice, but it's better than staying here because of racism. So he supports that. All right, so and there's been a lot more scholarship about colonization in like the last 10 years, and because it's anti-slavery. It's just a different version that we don't think about, but it is anti-slavery. It's premised that you need to stop slavery. There is some Southern support, but the Southern support, by white Southerners is if any slaves are freed, then they must go. So that portion of colonization isn't really, anti-slavery. All right, so citizenship before the Civil War, one historian calls that the prehistory, because we don't really have solid notions on citizenship. But though in the most basic sense, you're talking about belonging to a political community. And if you belong to a political community, you have certain rights, and the hallmark becomes suffrage. And not to get off topic, but that is even a struggle before the Civil War. States like Illinois allowed aliens to vote. You didn't have to be a citizen to vote, and then citizenship gets linked with voting. And the progress before the Civil War, 1800, 1860, you start with like property is linked to voting, and then things like being a taxpayer or being in the militia is linked to voting, and then it becomes just white males can vote. Okay, and as it moves toward white manhood as the qualifier for citizenship, that excludes everyone else. Okay, so the more it gets tied in with white male suffrage, that means blacks lose rights from 1800 to 1860. They're able to vote more at the beginning of the century than right before the Civil War. All right, so Lincoln was always anti-slavery. This is consistent, okay? So he's always anti-slavery. So very early in his career, he and Dan Stone, these are two Whig legislators, they say that the institution of slavery is founded on injustice and bad policy, but this is also fairly consistent. Lincoln's never an abolitionist until the Civil War. So he's not an abolitionist because abolitionists want to end slavery immediately. He doesn't think that can happen, and it has to be gradual. And he also, as a Whig, he's very conservative. He has a conservative view of the Constitution, and he doesn't think like on the federal level you can do anything to affect slavery. So the hope, and this is later shown with Republicans, in the 1850s, the hope is that if you stop the spread of slavery, it will gradually die out, and they mean gradually. It's going to take a while. All right, so at the same time, he's anti-slavery. He's also very consistently until the Civil War against blacks having any kind of political or civil rights. So the only right he would support, because he did have black clients in his law practice, is like blacks being able to sue on a contract. But he supports the black laws in Illinois. And in the 1836 election, Martin Van Buren is Jackson's vice president. He's running for president. One of the main critiques by Whigs like Lincoln is that Martin Van Buren supported the right of blacks to vote in New York at their 1821 Constitution. So they had a property requirement in New York, and that allowed anybody who met that property requirement, white or black, to vote. Right, so then they're going to move to universal suffrage, but they only do that for whites. So they eliminate the property requirement for whites. They keep it for blacks. And the Whig critique is Martin Van Buren supports the right of blacks to vote, so he's terrible. Okay, so that's the basic critique in 1836. So this is a weekly paper, and every week there's an article about this and saying, this is the candidate for blacks. This is Martin Van Buren. Okay, so this is Van Buren in favor of extending the rights of suffrage to free Negroes. All right, so then Lincoln, we know Lincoln wrote like a lot of synonymous or anonymous articles for this paper. He's real tight with the editor, and people talked about him delivering articles all the time. Michael Burlingame at one point thought he could software would answer which ones were his, but that hadn't happened yet. But there is one thing in Sangamon Journal that's written in black dialect. It's incredibly racist, that it's obviously written by Lincoln. This is something Lincoln wrote. And it's black dialect talking about how Van Buren is the candidate, all right? So this is Lincoln, 1836. He's anti-slavery, but he's also not supporting black rights. So this same thing happens when Van Buren runs for re-election. Same attack by the Whigs and by Lincoln. So more love for free Negroes, and then a most extraordinary act of Van Buren. The extraordinary act was allowing Negro servants to testify against a white man. Okay, so this is the criticism of Van Buren by Whigs like Lincoln. And Lincoln, someone gave a summary of one of his speeches in 1840. He reviewed the political course of Mr. Van Buren, especially his votes in the New York Convention in allowing free Negroes the right of suffrage. All right. So in Illinois, so the Midwest, the northern states, the Midwest is the most racist part of the North. And in those states, they have things that are called black laws. And what black laws do is like pretty much curtail all black rights, all right? So Illinois and Illinois just keeps adding these. They just add more and more and more until finally it culminates in 1848. So blacks can't vote. They can't serve in the militia. Okay, it's only whites can serve in the militia because military service is tied to citizenship. They can't run for office. They can't give testimony in court. A black person and a white person can't get married. Okay, if you're going to live in Illinois, you have to put up a bond, $1,000 bond. If you don't have a bond, then they grab you and you have to work off the bond. And then after you work off the bond, then you're required to leave. In 1848, they actually passed a constitutional amendment that says blacks cannot even enter the state, and that other states follow suit. So these laws, Lincoln supports consistently. There's never a critical word about this from Lincoln. All right, so the abolitionist Wendell Phillips in 1860. This is a really accurate view, expression of Lincoln's views. So, do you believe Mr. Abraham? So this is like an interview with Lincoln that Phillips is posing, that he's representing Lincoln's views, and he's totally accurate. Do you believe, Lincoln, that the Negro is your political and social equal, or ought to be? Not a bit of it. Do you believe he should sit on juries? Never. Do you think he should vote? Certainly not. Should he be considered a citizen? I tell you frankly, no. Do you think the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal? It intends the political equality of blacks and whites? No, sir. So that's absolutely correct. All right. So anti-slavery doesn't support black rights. If slavery were to end, what would you do? Lincoln, into the Civil War, supports colonization. Okay, so that's going to be the end game of the end of slavery is going to go to colonization. And so he thinks there's going to, there'll be gradual emancipation. You'd couple that with colonization. And in doing this, he's following his political hero as Henry Clay. Okay, so his beau ideal of a statesman is Henry Clay of Kentucky. And Henry Clay was long involved with the leading colonization group, the American Colonization Society. And Lincoln follows Clay very closely on this approach. Okay, and so here's their journal, and this is a speech by Clay. So Lincoln did a eulogy on Clay in 1852, and so Clay's very much like Lincoln. He's anti-slavery. Unlike Lincoln, Clay owned slaves, so he's kind of like Thomas Jefferson, being anti-slavery and having slaves. So he was ever on principle and in feeling opposed to slavery, and he did not perceive on the question of human right that Negroes would be accepted from the human race. That's where Lincoln starts. Black, whites both have natural rights. All right, and he quotes the Clay's 1827 speech to the American Colonization Society about the moral fitness of returning to Africa her children. Transplanted in a foreign land, they will carry back their native soil, the rich fruits of religion, civilization, law, and liberty. This is a common theme in colonization thought that blacks who have been grabbed and brought to the United States and their children and grandchildren, they've actually this has been an improvement for them because they've somehow been exposed to law and liberty as slaves. It's like, how did this happen? So then they go back, they're going to help, it's kind of like African Americans are better than Africans, is kind of this real paternalistic, racist notion. All right, so this is going, turn this original crime into a signal blessing. So Lincoln quotes that, and then he says, if the friends of colonization hope, present and coming generations shall succeed in freeing our land from the dangerous presence of slavery. So gradually, no one will suffer, be a glorious consummation. All right, so in 1854, he gives a speech in Peoria, in Illinois, and he starts, it's kind of a thought experiment. He said, what if slavery were just going to end? What happens next? If slavery just ended today, what happens? And he's pointing out, he doesn't even know what he would do. So I don't even know what would happen. That's why he's always pushing it, down the road, gradual emancipation. He doesn't know what you would do with immediate emancipation. So he says, my first impulse is colonization. And then he realized that's not going to work. If millions of people are suddenly freed, that's impossible to pull off. Because, this becomes the kind of a practical problem when people start actually seriously thinking about colonization in the Civil War. It's actually something serious, not hypothetical. It's, how could you possibly do this? This would take years. Henry Clay said, all we really want to do is, what's the natural increase per year in this, and let's make it that number so that gradually white population will grow, black population will stay steady, and then it would be a manageable number. That's what Clay thought. I don't think Lincoln ever thought that. All right, so I would send him to Liberia. That's my first impulse. He said, yeah, that won't work. Okay, that can't be done immediately. He said, what then? Free them all? Keep them as underlings? How's that any better? And underlings would be like a status in Illinois. They're not a citizen, they're not a slave, they're at like this intermediate position. Okay, what next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of great mass of white people will not. Whether that accords with justice and sound judgment, that's not the question. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, can't be safely disregarded. We cannot then make them equals. So what would work? Gradual emancipation. He comes back to gradual emancipation coupled with colonization. All right, then the same thing happens in the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So what the Republicans want to do is all about the territories. They want to keep slavery out of the territories. And Stephen Douglas says that, no, this is something that the white settlers would vote on if they want slavery, popular sovereignty. Lincoln's response is, you don't vote on that. You can't vote on natural rights. Those are God-given rights. You can't vote on that. So he's, has his anti-slavery position, and same thing though, not in favor of blacks having any kind of political rights. So anti-slavery, but no rights. Okay. All right, and then the war comes. Okay, and when the war comes, the great irony is that by starting the Civil War, the Southerners actually give Lincoln what he uses, the war power to end slavery. He wouldn't, he didn't believe he had any power to affect slavery, before then. So Sumter comes, the war comes. Now it's no longer in Ottawa in 1854. It's like this hypothetical thing. So what happens now? So this is now an actual possibility. Okay. So consistently in the first couple of years, he's talking about colonization. And he supports diplomatic recognition of Liberia and Haiti. Okay, that's actually seen positively because it's recognizing black-run governments. But this is about colonization. It would smooth the way for colonization. And he advocates colonization in his first message to Congress. One of his secretaries writes political articles anonymously, and in 1862, and he's seen as now by historians as when he's writing, he's reflecting what Lincoln thought. So summer of '62, Lincoln is obviously still thinking about colonization, but he's realized Liberia is a tough sell, so he's now toying with Mexico. But when he does that, Mexico and other and then the Central American republics, they all say no because they think if the United States comes, this is like imperialistic, that they're going to make too big of a footprint. Okay, and then some people think this is sort of the low point of his presidency. He gets a delegation of black leaders in District of Columbia to come to the White House. Okay, again, this is a positive. This is the first time this has ever happened. But then he doesn't he doesn't have a conversation. He lectures them. He's very condescending and patronizing about, you need to get with the program, you need to agree to leave, because that's the only way this is going to work. And he said, why should the people of your race be colonized, and where? Why should they leave the country? And then he explains, we're different races. There's a difference between us, but it's a great disadvantage. Your race suffers by this. Ours suffer by you being here. He goes on to blame blacks for, if we didn't have slavery, no Civil War, so that's all your fault. It's not a great performance by him. All right, but then, but during this time, he's thinking about emancipation already. So some historians say, oh, when he's talking about colonization, that's just to sell emancipation. I don't think that's true, because I think people would notice later when you said, oh yeah, I'm kidding about colonization. So I think he actually changes his mind. All right, so emancipation, they're waiting for Antietam, which was today. And then the preliminary emancipation, he does talk about colonization in the preliminary emancipation. Okay, so he says, look, we can do this, we can colonize. And then this is a great, I don't think this is supposed to be realistic, but it's like heavily symbolic. You can go look and find, there's the Bible, there's the rail splitter. That bust looks very precarious. But this is him writing the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, the Emancipation Proclamation is different than the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. There's not a word about colonization. And instead, the new thing in the Emancipation Proclamation is military service. So one talked about colonization, one talks about military service. So some historians say, oh, he's abandoned colonization and he's moved on. That's not true. But after emancipation, never publicly again does he talk about it. So if he's trying to whip up support, it's a weird way to do it, because he stops talking about it, but these schemes continue. So there's the Central American one never gets off the ground. It's, the promoter is untrustworthy. It never goes anywhere. Plus the Central American republics get really suspicious. They oppose it. They're not going to be able to work out anything. Then there's another promoter who's terrible. Sets up, it's Cow Island off Haiti, and that turns out horribly. They actually have to send vessels to rescue the people that are there and bring them back to the United States. There are low-key diplomatic feelers about colonization. They continue into the 1864. But Lincoln changes his mind. His secretary, John Hay, who I mentioned earlier, in July, this is pretty late, July 1864, I'm glad the president has sloughed off that idea of colonization. So his mind has changed. And there's two reasons, okay? I'm already running out of time. But there's two basic reasons. I'll try to get through both. One is military service. It's the performance of black troops. Lincoln is opposed to this, and this is said out loud. This isn't in a letter, but he said, so military service comes up, and he says, I'm not sure we could do much with the blacks. If we were to arm them, I fear in a few weeks the arms would be in the hands of the rebels. Why would they be in the hands of the rebels? Because blacks lack manly virtues like bravery and courage. They'd be dropping all the guns and running away. So that he says this out loud. So back
to when he publicly called them cowards.
Yeah, he's calling them cowardly. They don't have manly virtues like white men. All right, and this is really common among white male Northerners. This is a really common belief, and this is why, and they don't want to fight alongside blacks. All right, so he abandons this idea, okay? And when he starts calling for military service, the first group that realizes this is changing everything, are blacks. So black leaders like Frederick Douglass, with one courageous resolution, will blot out the handwriting of ages against us. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in a pocket. There is no power on earth or under the earth that can deny he's earned the right of citizenship in the United States. Military service and citizenship are linked together. That's an obligation you owe as a citizen. So if you fulfill that obligation, well, then you should be a citizen. Okay? So this is a recruitment poster. In the really fine print, it says, "A new era is open to us. For generations we have suffered under the horrors of slavery, outrage, and wrong. Our manhood has been denied." Because if you're a soldier, you're going to prove your manhood. "Our citizenship has been blotted out, but now our relations to the white race have changed." So here's another recruitment poster. Come and join us, brothers. This is a regimental flag that was recently bought by the Atlanta History Museum. And at the top it says, "We will prove ourselves men." Okay, they're going to prove manhood, and citizenship is tied to manhood. They're going to prove themselves men. Okay, so in battles like Fort Wagner, if you've never seen the movie Glory, you should watch it because it's about the Massachusetts 54th. And they don't even win this battle, but it's the bravery under the assault that changes like white conception of black manhood. Okay, so in today's part, it's a twist. It's black deaths mattered because they proved bravery. Okay, so by dying on the field, they're proving the rights of citizenship. And here's the gallant charge of the 54th. Okay. So Lincoln understands how important this is. The use of the colored troops is the heaviest blow dealt to the rebellion and one of the most important successes. Couldn't have been achieved with the aid of black soldiers. And he also points out what's going to happen. So we have disloyal whites in the South. We have oppositionist Democrats opposing him in the North. And then we have black troops. So he says, look, what's going to happen? There's going to be black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they helped mankind on this great consummation. Why I fear there will be some white ones, unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they strove to hinder it. And so that's one thing that's huge. All right, so performance of black troops. The other thing is, Lincoln in Illinois did not know a lot of black people, and the ones he knew had menial positions. He goes to Washington and he starts having interviews and talks to people that he changes his mind, I think, on the capacity of blacks. Okay, they're not, because when he used to talk about natural rights, he would actually talk about you can't take the labor that a black man has earned with the sweat of his brow, you can't take that away. He's seeing blacks as doing menial labor. Then he changes that like whites, blacks would have this right to rise. Okay, so Frederick Douglass has 2 interviews with him. The second one is great. The governor of Connecticut is waiting to see Lincoln, and they're saying, no, I'm talking to Frederick Douglass. Okay, wait. So he makes the white governor of Connecticut wait so he can talk to Frederick Douglass. And Douglass says, I can tell you how he received me, as one gentleman receives another, with a hand and a voice well balanced between kind cordiality and respectful reserve. In the manuscript, which hopefully will become a book someday, I go through a bunch of these type interviews and how people, how the people felt after meeting Lincoln. Lincoln then told John Eaton, who's a Union official, Mr. Lincoln had assured me that considering the conditions in which Douglass rose and the position which he attained, he was, in his judgment, one of the most meritorious men in America. Okay. He met Martin R. Delaney, who ironically was a proponent of colonization in the late 1850s. After Dred Scott, the black support for colonization goes way up, ends with Emancipation Proclamation. And Delaney was a proponent of colonization. Lincoln meets Delaney, and then he writes this note to the Secretary of War: do not fail to have an interview with this most extraordinary and intelligent black man. And he there's slavery ends in Maryland. A group of blacks come to the White House and they're celebrating the end of slavery in Maryland. And Lincoln has this address, it's not in his collected works, but he says, I hope that you colored people who have been emancipated will use this great boon which has been given you to improve yourselves both morally and intellectually. So I think Lincoln from the 1850s in Illinois to being in the White House, his attitude has changed, okay? And so that means he ends up supporting black suffrage, all right? He begins his political career criticizing Martin Van Buren because he supported black suffrage in New York in 1821. He ends his political career basically supporting black suffrage as a result of the end of slavery. So he tells Louisiana governor, I'm suggesting that you have suffrage for the very intelligent and those who have fought gallantly. This is his last public address. His last public address, he says, the new Louisiana government is unsatisfactory. He had hinted that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would prefer, it's now conferred on the very intelligent and those who serve our cause as soldiers. John Wilkes Booth is in the audience. He hears that and he says, that's the last speech he will ever give. All right? And that is my end.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.